This is Marian Moser Jones. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about my current research project on U.S. nurses who served in the war zone during World War I. Thank you to Pat D'Antonio, who's chairing the panel in which I am supposed to present this research. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all at AAHM due to a serious illness in my family, so I'm sending along this recorded presentation instead. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the 10,000 U.S. nurses who served with the Army Nurse Corps during World War I. These nurses, together with a small number of Navy nurses, formed the first cohort of American women to serve officially in the U.S. military in a war zone. And we know little about them. But with the help of the Karen Bueller Wilkerson Fellowship at the Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing at the University of Pennsylvania and an NSF Advance Grant from the University of Maryland, last summer I set off on several road trips to go look for these nurses. Thus far, I've traveled to 18 archives in 12 states to review diaries, letters, scrapbooks, and service records from 53 nurses, as well as a number of surveys that were conducted by Army historians in the 1970s. Now, most of this material is unpublished. Several nurses' family members have also come forward to provide me with access to their mother's or grandmother's diary and memorabilia. If any of you know of anyone who has a World War I U.S. nurse's diary sitting around or in their family collection, please contact me. Now, this project is not just about remembering the ladies, as Abigail Adams once said. While Christine Hallett, Alison Fell, and other British nurse historians have done a tremendous job in the past decade of writing the British and other Allied nurses into the Great War, nobody has taken a broad look at the role that the American nurses played in the war and how the war affected them afterwards. A few published literary works, such as American philanthropist Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone, and a couple of diaries have stood for the experience of the whole cohort. And more importantly, no scholar has taken the long view, what sociologists call the life course perspective, and looked at the way that war service fit into and perhaps altered the career and life trajectories of the U.S. nurses. And while my work is still in the preliminary phase, my findings thus far have led me to two conclusions. First, as others have found, American nurses contributed substantially to the medical aspects of the U.S. war effort throughout the war. Second, the war became a watershed moment for American nurses to defy traditional expectations of women and find adventure and professional fulfillment. Take, for example, Aural Baker Pardee of Eagle, Wisconsin, whose papers are at the Wisconsin Historical Society. I'm working on analyzing her diaries, letters, and other papers with two wonderful undergraduates, Mary Claire Collins and Julia Lee. Now, Baker Pardee was born in October 1886 as Aural Baker and grew up in a tight-knit Methodist Wisconsin farm family. She graduated from high school and became a teacher, then enrolled in the Illinois Training School for Nurses at Chicago's Cook County Hospital, graduating in 1912 at the age of 26. So by this time, she had already departed from the demographic norm for middle-class women, where women in the U.S. at this time were married and had their first child by age 21. As D'Antonio and others have shown, one of the many advantages of nursing as a career during this era was that it allowed middle-class women to delay marriage and childbearing if they desired to do so. Now, in August 1914, on the outbreak of World War I, the American Red Cross, in keeping with its mission of neutral humanitarianism, decided to raise funds to send teams of nurses and surgeons to hospitals in all of the belligerent nations. And ARC nursing leader Jane Delano and her associate Helen Scott Hay, who'd been the superintendent of the Illinois Training School for Nurses when Baker attended, hand-picked the nurses they were going to call up for this special duty. Hay herself led the unit that went to Kiev, then in Russia, to set up a hospital at a polytechnic school. And so Baker was one of these nurses selected for service in Kiev. She was actually part of the replacement group that replaced the first group that went over. Now, her family was not pleased with this decision. Her older brother Earl wrote her and said, quote, "It is hard to believe when you say you are thinking of taking up with that Red Cross proposition. From what I know of the work, I do not believe that it means certain death, but there is no denying that it is attended by a good deal of danger. You know how Mother and Father are going to feel, and unless you can give us some pretty good assurances, they will grieve all the time you are gone, and it will age them rapidly." But, he added, he knew she was so, quote, "pig-headed that it is no use to oppose you in anything." Well, Earl was right. Earl went, and it turned out that her experience at nurse training school, then known for requiring trainees to perform grueling duty in the hospital, strictly obeying their superintendent with only a half day off a week, provided more than ample preparation for Russia. Writing home, she stated, quote, "The work here reminds me of Cook County, only it isn't nearly as hard. I have two very good men to help me, so my work is to deal out medicine and watch. A Russian sister stays up to interpret." Now, after 6 months of hospital duty in Kiev, Baker decided to return home via the Trans-Siberian Railroad. The sinking of the Lusitania had occurred since she had sailed from New York, and the Russian host recommended that the nurses travel through Siberia and China to be safe. So Baker traveled with 3 other nurses and spent days having tea in their train compartment with young men from the Netherlands, Denmark, and other European countries. They also got to visit Beijing, then known as Peking, as well as Japan, and then Honolulu before returning home. Now, this is just one example of a larger trend of war as an opportunity for nurses to travel and have adventures. And this was not unique to these nurses. Numerous scholars have noted that travel and adventure motivated nurses in other contexts to sign up for war service, such as in the Anglo-Boer War in 1899. What's more, the U.S. was neutral at the outset of World War I, so patriotism and self-sacrifice were not that high on the list of motivations for nurses to serve. However, with the U.S. nurses, we have 2 distinct periods to compare to one another. One group went over in 1914 and 15, and then these others went over in 1917 and 1918 with the U.S. Army. And some, like Earl Baker, were part of both groups. And this is a unique feature of the U.S. nurses' writings, because the British, the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders all served for continuous periods. And so this means that unlike other Allied nurses, the American nurses were not burned out by 1917. Instead, they were excited to be joining the war effort. Second, while adventure and the desire to see foreign countries still seemed to be driving forces in 1914 and 15, patriotism and the desire to do one's bit in the war to end all wars strongly contended with these motivations in 1917. Now, lastly, from a medical point of view, it was a different war in 1917 and 18 than it was in 1915. In the interim, George Washington Cryle, the famed Cleveland surgeon, had led the development of a system of base hospitals. In December 1914, Cryle had gone to Paris with a team of surgeons from Lakeside Hospital in Cleveland to complete a 3-month rotation at the American Ambulance, a Paris area hospital funded with U.S. philanthropy. And after returning to the U.S., Cryle gave a speech on his experiences in which he discussed the, quote, difficulties and frictions that arose when teams of physicians who did not know one another were brought together in a European war hospital. And so he proposed that instead, U.S. medical units sent into a war zone be trained in the same hospital group. Quote, Surgeon General Gorgas then asked Cryle to develop this system, and each unit was organized from among the civilian personnel of a major hospital, preferably a teaching hospital, along with others who came from close by. And this was funded through a mix of private donations and public funds. From the beginning, the base hospital model included a large corps of nurses as well as nurse anesthetists. So to return to Baker, in 1917, she enrolled with Base Hospital Number 36, the Detroit College of Medicine and Surgery. and the unit sailed for France in November. In December 1917, she was sent to establish a hospital in a Vittel hotel, which she wrote is, quote, an awful dirty place when she got there. The original order for 150 beds quickly turned into 300. She expressed sadness over the deaths of 3 American soldiers. And as Hallett and others have noted, war nurses became mourners as much as healers. However, there's little to indicate that Baker was disheartened or overwhelmed by this duty. Her Christmas 1917 entry, for example, reads, quote, a beautiful Christmas with snow on the ground like we have it at home. We went to church and sang all the pretty Christmas carols. Got a joint letter from Mother, Father, and her sister Alice containing Christmas greetings. Also the news that her brother Earl is recuperating from typhoid. In the PM, I went to the cemetery with Miss Olson and Mrs. Lone to put wreaths on our 3 soldiers' graves. We gave the children of Vittel a moving picture show, and then 17 of us nurses from Hotel des Sports went to Hotel Lorraine for a good dinner, which we did justice to. We then went to the party and had such a splendid time. I danced with the Buffalo boys, she means men from a unit based in Buffalo, New York, almost exclusively. Home at 12. And so the diary continues in this matter-of-fact but happy manner, with visits to the YMCA for Vespers and patriotic programs, weekly church services, dances with officers, trips to the movies, and a trip to Paris where she and other nurses bemoaned the fact that they were too tired to take advantage of the nightlife. And yet, she does not display an unrealistically rosy view of military life. She noted that some of the privates were promoted to sergeant, but deserved, quote, a demotion instead of a promotion. She had a few days where she felt despondent because she lost a power struggle with officers, presumably over the running of her hospital. But then she bounces back. In March, she's sent to Compiègne, where she gets to work at the Ambrine Burn Hospital, where there's special treatment called Ambrine, which is a proprietary kind of paraffin that is sprayed over burns. And this treatment is supposed to facilitate healing, but it seals the infection in the wound. And this was a problem with the treatment, and that's why it was not continued. They also get to go to the Carrel-Dakin Hospital, where French surgeon Alexis Carrel and Anglo-American chemist Henry Dakin had developed the Carrel-Dakin treatment for wounds, involving an antiseptic solution of sodium hypochlorite and boric acid in precise concentrations, delivered through this system of rubber tubes into the wound. And the key to this method was that the nurse had to insert the system of rubber tubing into the wound right away and ensure that the solution was irrigating correctly and that the patient was not being tortured by this treatment or burned, and that this treatment was basically carried out effectively. So the nurse was key to this treatment. And this treatment is credited with saving many soldiers' lives and limbs. Now, despite the fact that Baker at Compiègne was now close enough to the front to have to take cover in air raids at night, she seemed thrilled at her opportunity to learn to administer the Carrel-Dakin treatment and Ambrine. This was a big career enrichment period for her. And when she contributed to the Base Hospital 36 official history in 1922, she sent them the portion of her diary about her work in the Ambrine and Carrel-Dakin hospitals. Now, you might argue that Baker's cheery attitude is indicative of her distance from the front. But other American nurses did get close to the front, and it does not seem to have disheartened them. For example, Florence Williams with Base Hospital 20, the 2nd Pennsylvania Hospital Unit from the University of Pennsylvania, wrote in her diary about being mobilized to the front with a surgical team in early August 1918, near where the Battle of Chateau Thierry had just been fought, with thousands of American casualties. She slept in the mud and the rain and was given a gas mask and helmet for protection. On August 3, 1918, she wrote, "The villages we passed through were blown to pieces, trenches and wire entangled along the roads, shell holes and dugouts all along lovely woods and gardens, and fields of grain with poppies and cornfields. Soldiers sleeping all around in pop tents, cook tents opposite, and officers nearby. Taps at 9 p.m. No lights allowed. Sound of artillery during the night. We were ordered to stay in our tents in case there was a raid. Nevertheless, she adds, slept very well in a sweater and bed socks, although it rained hard all night. 3 days later, she wrote, chow line always in the rain and eat wherever we can, on ground or on our cots. Assigned to night duty, so slept in PM. On duty at 4:30 with 40 other nurses beside ourselves. In OR, fine operating teams. Worked until 11 p.m. Called again at 3 a.m. Scrubbed up for Major Eliason. A few days later, she writes, not so busy, only about 45 cases. One a German prisoner. Very good looking. So she seems to be very engaged in this work and very alive. In fact, she soon gets a cold, and when they have to go back to the base hospital on August 16th, she writes that she is, quote, very much disappointed, even though she's suffering from this cold. And she's really mad because she has a bad cough and they don't let her go back to the front 2 weeks later. And instead they send her to the seaside for rest, and she doesn't get to go back to the base hospital until after the armistice. Near the end of her diary, before she returns to the U.S., William comments that another nurse said of her, quote, Miss Brothers said I was made of Indian rubber and rye. And indeed, like many other nurses, Williams and Baker seem to be very resilient in the face of the privations and horrors of war. The literary historian Paul Fussell famously argued that the relentless horrors of trench warfare were so incompatible with men's prior worldview and experience that they led to this collective psychic split from the past, spawning new, quote, structures of irony which became distinctive features of modern memory and modern writing. And the assumption thus far has been that this was the case as well for women who served in the war. If you look at Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, or Mary Borden's The Forbidden Zone, or U.S. nurse Helen Newbold Lamott's much ignored and beautifully written The Backwash of War, you can see this dark irony in clipped modernist prose. But as you can see from the previous examples, the war did not seem to have made the rank-and-file U.S. nurses disillusioned or nihilistic in the same way. In fact, if anything, many of the nurses whose writings I'm reviewing seem to cling more closely to family, home, and religion during and after the war. Baker, for one, returned home and became a public health nurse, then married an older dairy farmer named Harold Pardee. They had no children. She remained very active in her Methodist church and her community. And she kept her small savings from her wartime earnings in public health nursing work, even while married. And by the late 1930s, if you believe her ledger, this savings turned into a large nest egg equivalent to several $100,000 in today's money. And even in her 70s, as notes in her diary indicate, Pardee took a leadership role in a church auction, and she was the only woman, along with several men, to canvass the town's businesses on foot in order to solicit donations for the auction. Like many nurses in my sample, she lived into very old age, living to be 90, and she appears to have lived what appears to be an independent life in which career and marriage were balanced with participation and leadership in her community. My preliminary findings from diaries like Baker's and Williams thus indicate that the war made American nurses modern, but not in the ways that Fussell argued with regard to men. These nurses' war service seemed to have empowered them to become full citizens and leaders, to pursue careers after the war, and to give them a broader array of choices about their family lives. It's impossible to overstate the extent to which these trajectories represented departures from their Victorian-era mothers' lives. And although these women appeared less able to take credit for their accomplishments than would later generations of women, they blazed a trail that we're still following today. Thank you.